This is your head of teaching and learning speaking. AA, get out the vote. Current stats are, of the membership, of around 2,000 eligible members who might vote, 297 have voted. Of 286 staff, 166 have voted. Any staff member within the range of my voice, go vote. And of our 659 students eligible to vote, 332. And I think that number could be improved upon greatly in the next 24 hours, because 24 hours is all we've got. Voting ends tomorrow. We need to get out the vote, and I'd urge anyone busy with previews, busy with life, to pause and reflect on the discussion we're having today about education and what it means to get our teaching degree awarding powers. It means a lot of freedom to do the sort of radical things you'll be hearing about at this session. Thank you.
I wanted to speak a bit about Studium Generale, which was a designation given to universities, schools really, it first came into usage this term in the 12th century, and then it became more common usage in the 13th century. And of course there were schools before there were universities. There were schools, you know, dating back to the first sort of agrarian kind of cultures on the planet. However, what's unique about the idea of Studium Generale, which was a designation given to certain institutions in medieval Europe, was the criteria by which they acquired that title. So Studium Generale was the name that kind of predates the terminology of university, and what it meant was that these institutions were obliged to take students from all over Europe. They are by definition international institutions. They were, in a sense, they operated by the quality of the teaching that they offered. So there was no mandate, there was no official law or mandate from the church that created this designation. It was basically based on the merit of the teaching that people were attracted to these universities. And the third thing was that they provided a set of skills by which the people who participated in these schools could go back to their given societies and then help regenerate them. So we can see that, in a sense, the Studium Generale, which was considered to be the most prestigious designation that a school or a collection of schools in a city could obtain. So I've made a few little slides.
The interesting thing, for instance, Bologna starts a very complex negotiation. If you would be a foreign national and one of your compatriots commits a crime, all of those nations would be punished. And so the idea of coming together as a student body was a way through which the different nations would somehow negotiate with the city. And the fact that they started counting each other was important. So there's a union of students at the beginning that counters basically racism, and it's a very interesting birth of Studium Generale. And because there were so many, they just said, look, we're going. Then you don't have a city.
I think probably this word itinerant will be useful in future discussions about the AA. This sort of rigid adherence to 2 years, say, in diploma. You can't take 3¼ years, or you can't take 1 year, then come back 3 years later. But I suppose that in America, I'm not that familiar with the credit system allows a certain amount of itinerant behaviour. You can carry your grades, can't you, to another university, theoretically? Mm-hmm.
Some, yeah.
The other argument, of course, is that the AA is a counter to that trend of itinerance. It's a kind of much more solidly based thing. Yes, if you can't do it in 2 years, you're not going to do it in 5. No, you used to be able to, particularly in the diploma course, move in and out. Some students deliberately took longer. I remember Carlos had a very famous honours diploma, and they were done by 2 people, and they said, no, it's going to take us 2 years. And so they took an extra year, then presented it later. So no, it hasn't. It hasn't always been so rigid, the adherence to the unit, either that you had a tutor, but you actually were itinerant, if you like, use that word, from tutor to tutor. You see, rather than now where you're in this cell, aren't you, of influence, which has its advantages. It certainly does.
Carrying off of what is being said, I did my undergrad at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, and I was able to take my liberal arts classes at Brown, and I did my studios at RISD. So it was a very nice collaboration between universities, and the Rhode Island RISD actually operates in a way where you can actually choose what studio you want to do. And it's still semester-based sometimes, and some teachers do push for it to be a year-long, which is possible if your project requires it. But it's kind of like over here where you can choose, but it's the exception, like you said. It's not how it's done usually.
These are probably things which once everybody has voted and get this thing on the track, we can have that sort of open up more the kind of discussions that hopefully these people who've thought about this stuff. Should we move to Illich?
Sure.
You know, is that a good? I don't know how you segue from 12th century Italy to Ivan Illich, but
Okay.
Sophia will have a go.
He argued that educators freed from the restraints of schools could be much more effective and deadly conditioners. Without a full realization of the political and ethical dimensions of conviviality, what can happen is not so much deschooling but reschooling. The activities of daily life become more deeply penetrated by commodification and the economic and social arrangements that it entails. Learning becomes branded, and our social and political processes dominated by the requirements of corporations. Informal education changes the character of other institutions and formations. He argued that for changes to all institutions so that they could become more convivial for learning.
What's the date of the book?
1971.
It's on the frame. All right. So, can you summarize that? Why were you particularly interested in Illich?
I think the way in which it releases the institution and becomes these sort of networks of community and social spaces instead of these closed, sort of highly restricted. I think there's just such a potential for exchange and communication within a much larger network than we have within our small bubble here at the AA.
But we have Steve here who actually studied with Illich, so we can get it almost from the horse's mouth, can't we?
A long time ago, I worked with Ivan and studied with him in 69, 70 when I had a fellowship and lived in Chicago. One of the things he did in discussions with us and encouraged us to do in our work, and I was based at a place called the Urban Training Center for Christian Mission, and a guy who was director there, who went on to be the dean of the Anglican Cathedral in New York, just to give it a context, brought Ivan from CDOC, Cuernavaca. He ran a center in CDOC in Mexico, called CDOC in Cuernavaca, Mexico. What he was essentially doing, both in health and education at the time, it seemed to me, was to invite us, as we still have to do, to explore what those words mean and so on. And he made a distinction, as I've always done, between education and schooling. And also in the health world, he talked about how the fact, particularly in the States at the time, and it's still true, because you commodify things, you actually aren't talking about health, you're talking about disease all the time. You're not. Now, there's been a bit of a shift, I think, over the decades, thankfully, and we begin more to talk about prevention. But going back to the education thing and what might be relevant to this institution, and Ivan well, he was an Austrian by birth, and his English was great, but spoke lots of languages, but the way he wrote is quite complex to just listen to it. But I thought the book that I brought a couple of books which I thought might be relevant, and the more general book, which he published very soon after, he published this in '73, is called Tools for Conviviality. And I just thought what he said about conviviality, as you were talking, resonated somewhat. So as a way of just furthering the discussion, I'll just read that and then pause, really. But I choose the term conviviality to designate the opposite of industrial productivity. I intend it to mean autonomous and creative intercourse among persons, and the intercourse of persons with their environment, and this in contrast with the conditioned response of persons to the demands made upon them by others and by a man-made environment. So it seems to me that whole process of exchange between people and having something of a scale that is manageable for humans, really. And I suppose that resonates enormously with some of Schumacher's work, which I was exposed to at the time. And the other guy who I think is very important for me, that was based in Chicago at a university at Northwestern, is a guy called John McKnight, who in his late 80s is still has a very alert mind and still contributing to this kind of debate.
I used to have a group. David, when I was first invited to join your group, I had a group at Cornell called the Convivium, based on some of these themes. So it's nice to see things. When I saw the premise for today's talk, I immediately thought of Colin Rowe's assertion that there are only two models of architectural education that ever had much currency. One had a long life, one had a short life. And, of course, he's referring to the École des Beaux-Arts and the Bauhaus. And I wondered about the Bauhaus model and its founding when Gropius reformulated the school as the Bauhaus. One of his first hires was this young, crazy man, Johann Itten, born in 1888, lived in 1967. And Itten was an odd choice. He had strange ideas about education. He was trained as a proper Froebelian kindergarten teacher, and he thought he'd be appropriate to develop the foundation course, or the 4 courses they called it, at the Bauhaus. And he developed an amazing course, a course that was the threshold to all other parts of the curriculum. Everyone had to pass through it, and of course, famously, there were interesting entrance exams like color in 3 different shapes accurately. But in the end, between the color theory Itten was training the students to appreciate, between the modes of drawing and fantasy, so-called designing in the 4th dimension, he would encourage students to make models that were not models of actual things, but models that were meant to generate ideas. All those things sound to me still incredibly experimental. The trouble was, Itten was part of a Mazdaism cult, and bit by bit over the years, we're talking about the 1920s, he started to require students to adhere to certain principles of his cult. He asked them to shave their heads, to wear long flowing smocks, right? Because I think we're all used to some costume. And they went along with this. He asked them to be vegetarian. He asked them to give up sex when they were working on a project so they could focus their energies properly. He asked them occasionally to pierce their skin to let out impurities. So this is going on. And Gropius, right, who's a man of the world, sees this as getting a little dicey. He took a chance on this radical educator. But finally he has to ask Itten to go. And he says the reason being, of course, you've turned this 4 course, this foundation, into a kind of cult. Itten's response was, well, every studio is a kind of cult. Every seminar is a kind of cult. And a school should be a collection of many cults. And once you're through school, the students go out into the world and found their own cult, their own true way of living. And that's a nice microphone drop, right, as you head out the door of an architectural education. But I think in certain ways the word cult wasn't a scary word for Itten. And the Bauhaus being one of the 2 models of education that Rowe felt still had currency. Rowe wanted to read every program as being a certain proportion of either Beaux-Arts or Bauhaus. All I would say is I think that's a little limiting, and I think the AA might be a tertiary part of that world of unique education models for architecture.
LAWuN seems to be some aspect of a project which I've been running for a long time, not a project, more a set of questions, the Invisible University. And I have to be very simple-minded here. You may not be able to see these three pictures, one of which is of a traditional classroom with the master at the top. The other was a technical development in the 60s, which was a two-layer carpet where there was always a problem with power for these things, and the carpet ran, I think it was 10 volts through it, and you just push this special plug in anywhere, and then you sat round there in a circle with these children. And that seemed to me to be an intermediary between this fully itinerant kind of picture of the laptop, which in the end seems to finish up in a room with a lot of other laptops, but of course it doesn't necessarily. But of course the next stage is that, I suppose, isn't it, where the laptop disappears into your phone. Now you could say, maybe perhaps Lawrence would say, that this is all completely irrelevant, this technology, but there hasn't been a stage in history where technology hasn't kind of rearranged bits of society, and it's bound, I would say it's bound to happen. It must happen. And one of the chances when the AA gets its degree, is that it has the security, then, it seems to me, to begin to experiment with these different things. I mean, it doesn't. If there was a unit which was hardly ever here, for instance, or was always travelling around.
I was just thinking, in the light of the comments, from my experience of him, what Ivan would do in this context, because I think the first question he'd ask, which he often asked a lot of us, which is a pretty difficult question, it was for me then and it is now, is what on earth do you think you're doing here? And he'd ask that at a number of levels, whether it was the hierarchy, the management team, and he often asked it of quite senior people in the Roman Catholic Church, and got not quite excommunicated, but certainly he resigned his ordination as a result. But in having asked what on earth do you think you're doing here, I think the other thing in terms of a culture of a place, and this is this is 45 years ago, so pre a lot of the technological stuff, although I take your point that it perhaps hasn't changed much, but I think he'd then go on to encourage us all to think, as he did in health, but in the concept of schooling, what on earth, he'd make a distinction between schooling, and it's interesting the word the school is held up in some kind of very striking way as a cultural phenomenon. You know, when you talk about the school, I get a sense that everybody here knows exactly what they're... And he'd be saying, but where does education happen? In a school. That was his real challenge in the book, the Deschooling Society, because he would be saying to us that education doesn't, that whole process, which I'm very interested in, how individuals and groups get led out of themselves to explore new realities and be challenged and to fail and to learn from failure. None of that is really emphasized in a school, and that was one of his kind of major things. Just like in a healthcare system, health isn't promoted because of the profit motive in the States. Disease was promoted because you make money out of treating disease, particularly drug companies and so on. So I think there's quite a challenge to us all about what on earth do we think we're doing here, and then what does that lead on to, really, particularly around this kind of creating, and I suppose it resonates with a lot of some work that Christian Schumacher did around and based at Dartington College down in Devon, was the scale of things, really, which seems quite important in today's kind of setting, really.
Then a second menace emerged in the late 19th century, but by the late 1960s, it was clear it too would have to be controlled. That's called hyper-democracy. If too many people take democracy seriously and understand how to form alliances with one another to confront power with power, then power becomes much less effective. So when the kids stopped the Vietnamese War, waves of them, I mean, this was so intolerable. The costs to privileged classes of this rain of money, the costs to the government of not being able to suppress dissent on the grounds that this is an emergency. This couldn't be allowed to happen again. The Trilateral Commission gave me the break I needed to understand this more precisely. They underwrote the publication of a book called The Crisis of Democracy in 1975, published by New York University Press, in which now you have to have training in reading between the lines because the sophisticated power brokers aren't nakedly making these statements. But if you read Crisis of Democracy carefully, you will see that the crisis is too many people took it seriously and translated the principles into action and cost the industries and the hierarchy a war that, now the next war would be harder to run. I mean, to get together. It would be more absurd, at least you could make it.
Well, Powell's memo expresses the concerns elicited by 1960s activism at the right end of the mainstream spectrum. But much more revealing, I think, is the reaction at the opposite extreme, the liberal internationalists. And these are spelled out in the Trilateral Commission report that I mentioned. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. The crisis of democracy that they were talking about is literally that there's too much democracy. The problem, they said, this is leading figures, major political scientists from Harvard and so on. The public, the way that the democratic order is supposed to work, the public is supposed to be passive and apathetic. The Lippmann, Bernays, Emerson, Madison model, or Hume. They're supposed to be passive, apathetic, but in the 60s they were beginning to organize to press their demands. That's what was being done by what are called the special interests. The special interests are women, young people, old people, workers, farmers, the population, in other words. They're the special interests. If you look through and when they press their demands, there's too much pressure on the state. The state can't deal with them. So therefore they have to moderate their demands. Now there's one group that isn't mentioned, the corporate sector. And that makes sense because they represent the national interest, not special interest. So just like the far right, the liberal internationalists assume that their extraordinary power and their control of the state and other institutions is just the natural order. A primary concern of the trilateral scholars, just like Lewis Powell, was the failures of what they called, I'm quoting, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, the churches, and the like. They're not carrying out their duty to indoctrinate the young properly, and that's why we had this time of troubles. In general, they said we have to have more moderation in democracy if the national interest is to be protected, including much more successful indoctrination of the young. Well, the Powell memo and the trilateral study spell out the concerns that
I think it's quite interesting to paint a clear line between democracy and universities and schooling. I think this is not necessarily something that we should shy away from, in that I think when you are participating in an institution like a university, you're actually participating in the society at large in a very sort of, embedded way. And that, in a sense, is what regenerates whatever social order exists. So I think, like coming from a top-down perspective of what is being sort of brought out in that article, we could, I think that's super powerful to see how much agency lies in education. And that's where I wonder about the difference between education and data, because I think sometimes Illich is misread in a sense that free data and free access to all information thereby allows there to be, a completely new paradigm of education, which I believe is completely false, because I don't think that free access to all information gives you an education. I think it's a completely different process, and I think that's something that actually bears weight in the discussion about how we would think about the AA in the future, even.
Top-down approach, I think it also goes bottom-up. Like, I think the way in which we structure our universities or our schools then feeds into how we understand the structure of society or jobs or life in general. And I think if we're teaching in these sort of narrow-minded ways where the unit is the boss, the professor is the boss, and you are working for this person and you're doing the duties and checking off all the boxes and getting the high scores on all the tests, then that feeds into the workforce as well. And I don't know, just thinking about some of the other schools we were talking about, in the way in which after you leave, you've learned now how to stay up all night till 6 in the morning. You've learned that that's how architects work, and then you get funneled into these big firms where you're a tool for them. And I think that's sort of the way in which a lot of architecture schools are pushing to teach architecture, and I think AA is one of the last ones that isn't like that and encourages, the school closes at 10 p.m., you're encouraged to have your own point of view, to speak against the tutor's points, to argue, to debate, to challenge what the brief is, and I think that's really important.
Do you really find you're encouraged to argue with your tutor?
Or you're allowed. It's even a thought that you could. I think at most schools, the way architecture is taught, you're not even considered, that shouldn't even be something that comes to your mind. The fact that you have to design a tower and it has to be this many square meters and in this site is given to you, and there's no questioning that. I mean, the most you could question is maybe I'm going to use red color in my plans instead of black and white, and then they say, what are you doing? That's quite strange. Maybe, maybe you can question the style in which you draw, but even that is not encouraged.
Two small points. One to counter the reputation that I might build up otherwise as being a Luddite. I like the internet, and I use it. And for example, when I worked in an office, I was very bored, so I listened to a lecture series about Heidegger, quite a long one, a very, very thorough one, all online, given by Hubert Dreyfus, who's the most, one of the most respected interpreters of Heidegger. So while I appeared to be doing microstation, zooming in and out, I was in fact educating myself, as it were, in philosophy. He was educating me, exactly. And I was listening to it and I was using the internet, but I didn't have to sort of, when I did it, that was what I did. And like watching a YouTube video about cats, it's just sort of completely normal now. But it is quite different to education, and it happens in a quite different sphere. And in a way, I would never use it as a replacement, but it doesn't have to affect then the way I think about what I want when I go to a school, because what I precisely want when I go to a school is not something that I can just get on YouTube, because all that is great, but it is just on YouTube, and it's really simple, it's just there. You don't need to think about it too much now.
But maybe the role of the school is now more of that of community than
Exactly, to actually
learning
be in a
skills.
space.
Yeah.
So now, in a way, the premium is on being in a space and not being distributed everywhere, perhaps.
I mean, I guess I see these sorts of questions to be, in a sense, reflecting like the university as a microcosm of society at large, whereby, you know, you have people that you really value how they are teaching you. And I don't think that, you know, when we speak about units, there's any conspiracy to kind of insulate anybody in the school. You know, I think it more has to do with the impending pressure to produce a high amount of high-quality work, which is understood to be the defining characteristic of an AA student, more or less. And I think that in a sense has more of an insulating factor than any of the university professors or any of the tutors in the school. It's not that push towards a certain agenda which creates the isolation between the units. It's completely tied to production, I would say. Well, they're not locked though, man. You can walk in. You can.
They are locked. I mean, I think if you to discount that as merely like, well, you can knock and they can come in, and like, it's quite a symbolic gesture to put locks on the doors of each unit space. I think it's unnecessary, and I think to go back to this idea of like itineracy within the AA, that would be a really great thing. If you were loosely affiliated to a unit, like that was your main unit master, but you could go talk to anyone about your project. You could go show, like, without feeling like you were stepping on toes or it was weird.
I mean, I almost feel that comfortable. I almost feel that comfortable, and I think that's on the students, to be honest, is that ask. That's something that needs to be...
You're always assessed in relation to your unit's brief. You can't write your own brief and then go to a master and say, help me do this.
Yeah, but this gets back to the sort of administrative, like, why are you listening to a lecture given by that professor, you know, on Heidegger? Why is that, like, can we are always sort of skipping a step and saying, we're that institution that provided the framework for that guy to give that lecture about Heidegger is precisely that's attracted you to that lecture.
No, exactly.
And that's what I mean, like, when we talk about writing our own briefs and you know, like, we're sort of, I think, always overstepping that idea that this framework that's in the school, that is in every school, is incredibly valuable because it organizes knowledge. And that's why it's like, you know, when we're kind of faced with unlimited access to data and blah, 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 and, you know, we're tempted to sort of jump into this sort of, I don't know, pseudo-Buddhism, like everything is one, I'm educating myself, I'm part of this hive mind, and it's utter nonsense. It's not true.
Completely.
That's not how we work as a society.
But I agree, and I'm always like, you know, bringing up the Beaux-Arts and talking about how great I think teaching is, like being taught, how much I like being taught and not just discussing. All my best experiences in education have been lectures, have not been seminars or discussions. I've been lectured to, and that's great. But I just think that doesn't exclude a kind of a rethinking of the rigidity of the unit system at the AA, and that there could be more fluidity and more itineracy, and that could be positive, and you can still be taught. I mean, I talked about this when we did the archive thing, but but the project that Hugo Hinsley talked about, this Time House project, where he said, like, in the archive there is no information about who the tutor was, precisely because it was done by the student with a whole. He was his project, and he took it to Cedric Price, he took it to someone else here, and he used whatever he could. He was still being taught. Whenever he took that project to each tutor, they gave him their opinion, but he was able to move between people and pursue his own project, presumably because at that point in his time at the AA, he was confident enough, and not everyone is, that's fine, but like, he was confident enough to have his own project, which is in itself hard. But that challenge of having your own project is maybe, it's easier to just do a units project.
Yeah.
Well, we'll wind this wonderfully attended discussion up. Thanks everybody, particularly for Josh and Sophia for taking time from the table. And Lawrence, thanks.